Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I am Art Taylor, the President and CEO of BBBsGive.org. Our mission is to strengthen the bonds between donors and charities by helping donors make informed giving decisions and working with charities to promote high standards for ethics, which would include, of course, charity governance, effectiveness, finance, marketing, and communications materials. We work with charities to produce reports that are available free of charge at give.org and bbb.org to help donors give with confidence. I want to thank all of you for joining today, and I hope we create a space to learn and connect with colleagues who are interested in applying behavioral science to our charitable work. We all know that our intentions are not always backed by our actions. And whether we are talking about how many hours we want to work on a project, whether we exercise today, or how much money we spend on a trip to the grocery store, traditional economic assumptions about rational behavior tend to fail. At BBBsGive.org, we've been working to better understand how donors go about making their giving decisions. And we think there is an opportunity to help donors better match their intentions to give and give wisely. Now, in the private sector, a lot of resources go into understanding how to influence consumers. The folks at your favorite grocery store understand how customers move around the store. They study how and when to elicit a sensory experience. And they know exactly where to place sugar cereals so your kids will spot them. They know that people say they want more choices, but when given too many choices, customers are overwhelmed and tend to buy less. In a nutshell, they know when and how to intervene to influence all of us. Understanding how people make choices and behave can also have a powerful implication in social and charitable arenas. And with that in mind, we are joined today by Omar Parbu, Katie Davis, and Alani Fisher. They are the Future of Giving team at Ideas 42, which is an organization that works to apply insights from behavioral science to social problems. This team in particular develops and tests behavioral solutions aimed at improving the giving process. And we are pleased to have them here today to talk about closing the gap between donor intent and behavior. Alani, Katie, and Omar, thank you for joining us. And I now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks. Let me just share my screen. So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Alani Fisher. I'm a Senior Associate at Ideas 42 on our charitable giving team, and we're looking forward to sharing some insights with you that we've gained over the past couple of years working in the charitable giving space. And after this brief presentation, my colleagues Omar, Katie, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. So first, let's just start with a quick overview of what Ideas 42 is. Then we'll talk about some of the behavioral principles that guides all of our work here, and then move more specifically into the insights that we have gained working in the charitable giving space. So first, let's start with a quick snapshot of Ideas 42. We use behavioral insights from the behavioral sciences to design solutions to some of the world's most persistent social problems. And we do this by partnering with a diverse set of organizations and work in over 30 countries on a wide array of focus areas, from health to financial inclusion to education. And of course, we've also started working in the charitable giving space. Our work here has been made possible by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation And we've borne out a lot of insights, some of which we will be sharing today. So first, let's talk about some of the foundational behavioral science principles that guide our work here at Ideas 42. And the best way to do that, I think, is through a short quiz. So I will ask you there are 3 questions. I'll ask you one and give you just a few seconds to answer. You'll see the choices on the screen and the options will show up as a poll for you. So don't overthink it. It's something that you just want to go with your gut on, and then we'll talk about the answers at the end. So the first question is, a cup and a saucer cost $1.10 in total. The cup costs $1 more than the saucer. How much does the saucer cost? The next question, if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long will it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? And the last question, in a pond, there is a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire pond, how long would it take for the patch to cover half the pond?
Well, thank you. Weird.
Eleni, you may want to switch out of presenter mode so we don't give away the answers.
Oh my gosh, sorry. Okay, there you go. Okay, so sorry, I think some of you might have gotten the preview there of the right answers, but let's take a look at the correct answers here. You can see sometimes that your first intuition isn't always the right answer. I know that was the case for me. The answer that you tend to gravitate towards isn't always correct. So what's at play here? Why do some of us get these wrong on our first guess? Daniel Kahneman explains this best in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We have 2 systems that form thoughts in our brains. System 1 is autopilot, and system 2 is the deliberator. So a good way to think about this, or a good real life example, is when we're driving a car, it's usually system 1 that's in control, just kind of working on autopilot, doing something that you do every day. But if someone swerves into your lane quickly, your system 2 starts kicking in, you become hyper-focused, noticing a lot of details and making more conscious decisions about how to get back into a safe driving position. And very often we design programs and products that assume system 2 in situations that are really all system 1. And what happens is that our impulsive and automatic behaviors make mincemeat of the best laid plans. But there are a lot of ways we can design around that problem. So just taking a look quickly back at our answers to the quiz here, we can see that when system 1 takes over, we end up with the interesting answers, which at first seem like the obvious choice, but thinking more deliberatively, using system 2, we arrive at the correct answers. So now let's think about how thinking about systems 1 and 2 plays out in theoretical frameworks. Often designers, policymakers, and fundraisers assume a standard economic model where people weigh the costs and benefits of a situation, make a decision, and act accordingly, and then we can observe a positive or negative outcome. But if this model were true, you'd be able to infer people's preferences by the outcomes, but we know that's not. At Ideas 42, we look more at how the context of a situation can affect our decisions and our actions, and we examine what's shaping human behavior. So this approach refutes the point that outcomes can really reveal people's preferences. In fact, sometimes people aren't actually making decisions at all. It may not be presented as a choice, or we may be deferring that choice. Or even after we make a decision, we might change our minds. So we see that our environment, or the context in which we're making a decision, can really muddy that process. And we'll see that at play in the charitable giving space as well. So thinking about the context where people are usually making decisions in the charitable giving space, research shows that most giving is conducted in an emotional and reactive environment. It leads us to give when we're solicited or when our emotions are evoked. And that's fine. It's not a bad thing necessarily. Empathy is important and it leads us to do the right thing here, making a donation to charity. But depending on the context that we use to engage the donors, we can promote even more donations and caring. And we have reason to believe that people would like to be giving more. We conducted a survey a few years ago to better understand whether there is an intention and action gap here. We asked respondents about how much their neighbors should be giving to charity as a percent of their total income. And we asked people about their neighbors to reduce the desire of some people to inflate their answer and seem more generous. So the average answer we got was 6.1%. People think that their neighbor should be giving 6.1% of their annual income to charity, which is pretty high, especially thinking about how actually people are giving around 3% to charity. So it's a pretty big gap there. And even if you don't think that magnitude is necessarily accurate, we do have reason to believe that the true intention of how much people would like to give is not aligned with the reality of how much they are giving. So thinking about how we can fix this gap between intentions and actions, that's where we start to look more at donor insights. I am certain that many of you will recognize at least a portion of what we're about to cover, but we hope that it will provide you a deeper understanding of how some of these best practices can change behavior. First, we'll talk about identity. We all hold multiple and often conflicting identities at the same time. And we try to behave in ways that are consistent with the identity that is most salient at any given moment, which can have good or bad consequences. Researchers have explored how our identities can shape our actions by looking at groups who experience two identities with conflicting stereotypes. So thinking about math performance in the US, there is a common belief that Asians are good at math and that females are not. So in this study, researchers focused on Asian American females and how these conflicting identities about math could affect their performance on a math exam. So one group in this study indicated their Asian identity and answered a questionnaire about resident life at their university. You can see some of the questions here on the left that they were asked. They were reinforcing their identity as Asian Americans. And then another group indicated their gender as female and answered questions that reinforced their female identity. You can see some of those on the right. And then after they completed this questionnaire, both groups and then a third control group that didn't do one of these preliminary questionnaires completed a quantitative test with 12 math questions. And the performance was different between the three groups. But what was interesting was that when they asked all three groups how they thought they did on this test, they all thought that they had performed equally well. So the differences between what happened here were pretty subconscious. And the participants in the Asian identity salient condition answered an average of 54% of the questions that they attempted correctly. Participants in the control group answered an average of 49% correctly, and the participants in the female identity salient condition answered an average of 43% correctly. So this study gave us some pretty strong evidence that priming different parts of identity can change the way we react in a situation. Looking at an example more specifically related to charitable giving, in a large-scale field experiment conducted by the American Red Cross, researchers sent direct mail solicitations to individuals who had previously donated to the Red Cross but hadn't contributed in the last 2 years. So all the letters had this greeting, "Dear friend and supporter," but one set of the letters included a note that said, "Previous gift," and then the date that they had made their last donation. Researchers found that that including this extra line reminded donors of their identity as supporters of the Red Cross and increased the probability of them donating again by 20%. And they also saw the average donation amounts increase by about 4.1%. So again, identity is really important, and priming can shape giving behaviors too. The next insight I want to talk about is framing. Just like the way we get donors to think about themselves matters, so does the way we frame the beneficiaries of a donation. Let's look at the story of baby Jessica. She fell down a well in Texas in 1987, and people really rushed to her aid when this happened, and her family received over $700,000 in donations from strangers. And luckily, Jessica got out of the well safely. And we think there was such an outpouring of support because Jessica was an identifiable person in need, and saving her was an achievable goal. So thinking about that more broadly with fundraising, the reference group really matters. The image on the left here talks about 3.5 million people dying each year from water-related disease, which is a much larger reference group than the image on the right, which is just one identifiable child who's safe because of the mosquito net that's on its bed. So picking a reference group for the beneficiaries that's identifiable and a problem that feels solvable can shape how donors are perceiving a situation and maybe their willingness to contribute as well. And we talked earlier about giving being emotional and how having an identifiable beneficiary can trigger these emotions. And sometimes when we see statistics, we go into a more rational mindset, which may not be as caring. So a set of researchers wanted to test this theory about whether a photo or statistics would bring about higher donations. And a set of researchers gave study participants the opportunity to donate between $0 and $5 to famine relief efforts at Save the Children. One group received letters that included a picture and a brief description of a little girl. And the second group received letters describing factual information about food security. And the third group received both sets of information, the profile that you see on the left and the factual information that you see on the right. And the photo and description prompted an emotion-based response, raising twice as much money as just the factual solicitation alone, or the statistics. But including the factual information and the girl's profile together reduced that effect. You saw kind of an average donation in between the two, but there wasn't a significant difference in giving between those who received both pieces and those who received the factual information. But it's important to also recognize that donors aren't a homogeneous group. We have worked with Dean Carlin, an academic, on this portfolio, and he conducted a variation of this study where he showed a picture and statistics, which you can see here on the left of the slide, to donors who gave in the past to an organization working in Peru. And he found that larger prior donors who he suspected were more motivated by the impact of their donation increased their giving and their subsequent gift. But smaller prior donors who were more likely motivated by the warm glow feeling gave less. So I think the real lesson here is that for those of you who have the ability to get to know your donors and tease out different motivations for different groups, you may be able to target messaging to different groups to evoke the different responses for different groups. So let's also talk briefly about social norms and why and when they work. Social norms is the idea that we tend to reflect and respond to what other people are doing around us. And giving is a particularly ripe area for social norms. The main reason for that is giving is a typically private activity. We have a hard time knowing what others are doing in their donation behavior. So any information that we can get about that is valuable to us as donors too. So in one study, donors put a transparent donation box in a free art gallery and varied the contents in the box. In different trials, the box is filled with $100 in coins, in small bills and large bills, a mix of currencies, or no money at all. And then researchers tracked contributions by visitors to this gallery and found that donation amounts tended to reflect the original contents of the box. Presenting many coins resulted in a large number of small contributions, and presenting a few larger bills resulted in a smaller number of contributions at higher amounts. And then we have kind of like the middle here, middle participation with the mix of bills. So researchers here concluded that people estimate whether and then also how much other people are giving when they're making their own decisions about how to donate. But in thinking about applying social norms, we have to be mindful about how we use these solutions. There are a lot of situations where social norms can be applied poorly, like this example of an ad that was on a bus shelter in Brooklyn. The idea of this ad is that it's supposed to shock you with the number of people that are dropping out of high school every day. But instead, it kind of just makes dropping out of high school seem like a normal occurrence and something that might be hard to change. So people might not be so motivated to take action when it looks like such a normal occurrence. But let's talk about one more successful application of social norms in the giving space before we move to questions. So sharing information about peers or someone with a similar trait to you is another way to raise more money. In a radio station fundraising drive, a group of prospective donors were told that another donor had previously given $300, with the previous donor's gender matching the prospective donors. And then a second group was given that same information, but with the previous donor's gender being the opposite of the prospective donors. And the researchers in this study found that revealing similarities between the current and prospective donors increased the average donation amount by about 34%. So we hope this overview of some of the behavioral principles at play in the charitable giving space has been helpful for you all as you continue to think about engaging with your donors. Our team at Ideas 42 is currently working on our next phase of research in this space. We're currently designing some concepts to test at various stages of the donor journey, encouraging donors to become more intentional and thoughtful givers to charity. So with that, we are happy to take your questions.
Lainey, this is Shelley. I have a question for you. In this section, you talked about framing. Oh, let me back up. I work with community health charities and work mainly in the corporate space, corporate giving. And you talked about stats versus pictures and how that worked. Do you feel like with things like matching gifts and lots of different ways for folks to give, that would affect how we should approach giving in the corporate setting?
Omar, Katie, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
And I hope they're not muted.
Shelley, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I missed the last part.
Sure. In your framing section, you talked and gave sort of the stats on if you show just a picture versus stats and how they perform either individually or together. And in our work in the corporate setting, there are lots of ways for individuals to give at their company, matching gifts, employee engagement, volunteering, different things like that. Do you have any insights on how multiple opportunities speak into that might affect our approach on how best to go about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Shelley. And I appreciate you tying that to the research. There's one thing that, and Lenny alluded to this, that Dean Carlin, who is the author of the study, likes to mention over and over again, is that there's heterogeneity in how these results play out. So we see that the picture and the statistics depresses giving, especially for smaller dollar donors. and that when you have larger donors, they want to see that there's a really important impact. What's good about workplace giving is that there's a more intimate relationship with the employees and the employer who's running the campaign, which can create opportunities for better targeting of that kind of information. So if there's like a broad campaign that's looking at increasing participation rates, maybe the heavy information side of the equation is not the right approach. But if there are resources that are available to employees and other ways to engage employees in a more ad hoc but self-directed way, that could be a good opportunity to provide data and reporting for an employee who's interested in that to increase their willingness and desire to give.
Yeah, this is Katie from Ideas 42. Just to echo Omar, I think one of the biggest challenges of behavioral science is to think about what is the context for this specific group of people that is driving their behavior. And that's really where having good data on your employees and being able to track their giving in response to campaigns can play a big role, because then you can see, maybe you have some hypotheses around their demographics or their interest areas that are driving behavior. But as we know from testing a lot of these things, oftentimes our assumptions and our intuitions are wrong. So really having those channels ready to see how different people respond to messaging can be really helpful to sort of de-bias our assumptions about humans, and look a little bit more carefully at what those factors are that are really tying to behavior.
Great. I just wanted to also mention that this is open to the audience, and if you want to speak, please raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button in the control panel. And you can also submit text questions via the chat for our presenters as well. And by the way, we've engaged a handful of attendees to be more actively engaged and ask their questions. And so it was nice to have Shelley Aswan from Community Health Charities. Doug Pusoff is here also. He's a Senior Manager of Corporate Development at Movember. Rebecca Cohen is with us, who's the Corporate and Foundations Gift Officer at 1% for the Planet. And Lisa Estes is the Chief Advancement Officer at Ronald McDonald's House in Houston. Sophie Atwood is a Senior Behavioral Scientist with the Better Buying Lab at World Resource Institute. So have at it, folks. If there are questions you have, please ask them. It looks like my colleague, Danielle Fazell, her hand is up. Danielle, I don't know if you want to ask a question or if you just raised your hand mistakenly.
I'll ask a couple questions in the meantime, and then of course, inviting other people to ask. But as you know, we are in the business not only of kind of engaging people in the giving process with multiple charities, but we also want giving to be wise and to be informed. And we do think about this question about emotional giving and the benefits of that, but then when to engage the rational giving. And we come to kind of serve this subset of the population who intends to be a wise giver. And so I'm wondering if you have any insights of how to kind of reinforce that type of identity, and maybe something that applies to other groups, maybe to an environmental group that reinforces the environmentalist in you. So if there's any kind of advice there on how you go about doing that, other than kind of spelling out, as someone who is a wise giver, blah blah blah. Are there other ways to kind of elicit that identity in people? And then the other thing, because you just touched on kind of targeting groups depending on what might trigger those identities. Are there anything about kind of generational cores that have specific differences, or do you find that really age isn't an identity that plays a hard card in the behavioral part of things? And if there is there a lot of our charities, I think, are concerned on how to engage younger donors. Is there any advice on the behavioral side of things to engage the young population?
Thank you, Olivia. Can I start with your second question first? This is Omar again.
Of course, and they're not quite related, so sorry about that, but but yes, please do.
No, no worries. They're both good questions. The second one is just most recent and most salient in my mind right now. So,
Sounds good.
you know, there's a lot to say about how we cut up donors in different sort of demographic groups. And what I like to think about when I'm looking at giving across generations or even across genders and how we can segment people and think about their giving based on some identity, I'd actually like to take a step back and think about what is the context in which they're giving and why, how could that actually be informing their behavior as opposed to who they intrinsically are. So with the different age groups, one thing that I've noticed is, and I think this is going to be very obvious once I say it, but there are different social norms and cultures of giving that permeate how people make their decisions. So a lot of older givers know people who are also philanthropists and think about their giving very openly, have given to organizations for a long time, potentially sat on boards. So their peer group has a much deeper relationship with different organizations and charities, and that may inform how they think about their giving. Whereas new givers, because not only because they're young, but because usually they don't have disposable income or just are new to having disposable income, are starting to think about giving. They don't necessarily have friend groups that are doing so. They don't necessarily see people in there as who they identify as peers or relate to them in some identity or another as somebody who gives, and that can affect how they think about their giving. So cultivating the right peer group and showing people that giving is the norm in one way or another can really change the dynamic.
A question that came in from Ezra D'Amico was, do the findings hold across all types of giving? For instance, if people give cash donations, that would certainly lead to a type of finding. But what about in-kind and volunteer support?
Go ahead, Katie, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to jump in there, and feel free to add to me what I say, Eleni and Omar. So I don't know of specific studies that have looked in depth at these on a comparison basis. So there's some interesting work looking at the order in which you ask people to either volunteer time or donate money. And interestingly, they found that if you ask people to volunteer time and follow up with an ask around money, they're actually more likely to donate, irrespective of whether they actually volunteered or not. So that study suggests that there is some kind of link between volunteering and donating. The authors of that study thought that maybe it's this experience mindset versus a transactional mindset that cause that effect. So if I ask someone about volunteering, I'm thinking about the experience of volunteering, and maybe that has me feel a more personal connection to the charity. Whereas if I start off with an ask about money, maybe that puts people in a transactional mindset of how much does this cost to me, and how much money can I afford to give. So I think there's an interesting interplay there that tells you a little bit about the mindsets between volunteering and donating money, and that there is a link. But I don't know of specific studies that compare the two outright. Omar and Eleni, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Okay, I'll just build on what you're saying and echo it by providing real world examples. So in our recent work, we did a partnership with Public Good, which is this interesting platform, I guess is the best way to put it, that embeds these widgets in news articles that allows people to act in the moment as they're reading the article to either give, learn more, sign a petition, etc. So we're seeing that opportunity being presented to people when the need is most salient to them, which is a very interesting approach. What they have found is that there is a sort of ladder of engagement where when more people are likely to find out more information when that is available, that option, and that ability to find more information leads them to eventually donate. So even though there's extra steps that are involved, it's that slow walk to the donation that is quite effective on their platform in particular. So that sort of adds more backing in a real world example to the paper that Katie cited.
And Sophie, did you have a question or a comment? Sophie Atwood.
I do, thanks Art. Sophie here from the World Resources Institute. And it's been a really interesting presentation, and it's good to drive home the point that emotion plays such a big role in people's donation behaviour. I was just wondering if the team was familiar with any research that talks about which type of emotions are the best ones to try to target. So I'm thinking, do we go for ones that make people feel good, or ones that kind of make people feel bad? And are we looking for ones that are kind of quite arousing and stimulating, or ones that calm people down? It's a question that we're quite interested in at WRI, to understand really what do we want to make people feel in order to get them to donate more to charitable causes.
This is a great question, and one where there's been some laboratory testing, so in sort of a controlled environment, but I think fewer real-world field experiments, so take this with a grain of salt. There is evidence that prompting people to experience or recall a feeling of gratitude stimulates generosity and giving. There's also research suggesting that guilt can also be motivating and increases generosity. Now, that's a situation where the person was already in an environment where they were basically, under lock and key by researchers. So it's not surprising that they felt compelled to give after that guilt intervention that sort of tied their personal responsibility to this opportunity to give. I think the real question is, in a real world environment, does that still hold? When I could choose not to expose myself to this platform, right? I think I would not be surprised if stimulating negative emotion or feelings of guilt does cause people to disengage, because that's what we've seen in a lot of different areas like financial health, where you start to prime people to think about responsibility or negative emotion about their spending behavior. It does result in people avoiding that experience. So I think there's probably a fine line there between leveraging these ideas around personal responsibility, but not causing people just to veer away and avoid those negative emotions.
Another thing I would add is that, and we alluded to this a little bit in the study or in the presentation, but in some of the recent fieldwork we've done where we've presented issue areas like climate change that can feel really all-encompassing and hard to tackle, people might feel a little powerless in those situations. So maybe evoking emotions like of motivation or that they can make a difference is another way to stimulate more donations or more engagement.
Lisa, did you have a comment you wanted to make? Lisa Estes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, so at Ronald McDonald House, we are in a great opportunity right now where we are migrating from the server to the cloud with our Blackbaud NXT. And as part of that project, we are doing some multiple segmentations of our data and significant cleaning, recoding, et cetera. So we have started that this past spring by doing our spring mailer, and we started, it's your basic segmentation project, but one of the letters was to volunteers, another was to families, and the other was to the remaining donors. And each letter was specifically written to those people. And so we're going to see how that works. The next time we do a mailing, we're going to segment it even further and write even more specialized letters. And last but not least, on the response vehicle, we're offering different ways of giving that appeal to different ages. So we have the text to give option, and we have a code for that links back to our letter. We have birthday fundraising on Facebook. Then, of course, we have the traditional give on the card or go online. And then last but not least, we're offering people opportunities to give in kind. So we don't really know what all these options are going to bring, but we are trying to speak to different people.
Wonderful. Sharon Couture. I see your hand is up. I want to give you a chance to ask your question. Maybe we already answered it.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
So as you guys are looking at really this gap between the intent and the actions around giving, going off what Lisa was talking about with some of the different options around giving, I'm just curious if you have any sort of research around, really those like barriers at the point of donations and, by, people getting used to using things, like Venmo and these like quicker payments and stuff. If, there's things that you're seeing that are successful for charities to make that donation process as easy as possible, so you're not losing people once you have them in the pipeline. So just curious if there's anything that you have in terms of things you've seen on that side.
Good question, Doug. Let me first say, love the organization. Movember is why I have a beard now. It was my gateway.
I appreciate the support.
I love my colleagues and if they have examples. This is unfortunately a tough one for us to answer, but when we are working with different platforms, the one thing we really try to do is reduce as many hassles as possible when it comes to completing a donation. We do see the intention to action is a really short window, and especially because not making a donation doesn't have necessarily the same personal consequences as not making a purchase for one's own consumption. That drop off can easily happen and somebody not really feel the pain of that. So finding the right avenues to reduce the hassles, to close the intention to action as much as possible is really important. Also, going back to our initial point about giving being very emotional and reactionary, because of that being such a strong impulse to give, allowing platforms and processes to capture that in a way that doesn't turn something that is a system one decision into something that takes system two actions, that can really make sure that we are seeing completed donations as opposed to lost intentions.
Just to echo what Omar is saying, I mean, I think we see across all of the areas where we work that these small hassles really do have big impact. I would say we've done some other work with payment systems, not around donations, but things like needing to go find your password and your login again has real impact on whether people follow through with a transaction that they're in the middle of. And I think the hard part is often those types of small hassles can be most consequential for people who are already a little bit on the fence, right? If I'm an annual donor to some cause, I've already planned out my giving, and I get interrupted somewhere, I probably will still come back and complete that donation if it's something that I'm habitually care about and am engaged in. But if I'm maybe on the fence and I wasn't sure about it to begin with, if something interrupts it and my attention goes elsewhere, it's much more likely that I'll just drop off. So I think these types of hassles can be really consequential for people whom we're trying to convert or engage who haven't previously been really engaged.
That was definitely also echoed in the diagnosis interviews we did earlier this year, talking to people about what their barriers are to becoming intentional and repetitive givers to charity was just that kind of lack of ease or instantaneous ability to make a donation.
Wow.
This is Rebecca from 1% for the Planet. And I was curious, since you shared a lot of really great research and actions nonprofits can take for people that do work for nonprofits on the call, is there one that stands out as, like, if you're going to make a change tomorrow, what would you go for?
That's such a great question, Rebecca. I think part of it has to do with how easy the changes are to make and how much institutional support you'll need to make the changes. If there's low-hanging fruit around eliminating small hassles, I always advocate doing that sooner rather than later, because some of these deeper interventions, like working around mindsets or emotion, those can be harder to understand what's going to influence them. So there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit you can take care of just in terms of streamlining the donor experience, and then be a little bit more thoughtful around how you structure tests around identity norms and that sort of deeper motivation. Not to say that you shouldn't do them, but there's probably a lot of things you could knock out of the way first.
So my colleague, Bennett Weiner, had a question. He said, one of the points raised is that small donors are more influenced by emotion and large donors seem more influenced by impact information. For purposes of this research, how did you define small versus large donors in terms of gift size?
In the specific study that's referenced in the presentation, it was donors that had given over $100 or less than $100 for the previous donation.
Wow, interesting. Jean wanted to know, Jean Mastay, would you go back to Elvia's question about what we can do to motivate wise givers, or at least what is it that she says she may have interpreted her question to be that? Is there something we can do to motivate people to give wisely, meaning with less emotion, I would assume, and more intellect involved?
Yeah, I wouldn't take away the emotion necessarily, but but because I think that's an important component, right? But I think there's a lot of people, certainly we do our own donor expectation studies, and there's a very large group of people who tell us that they want to do homework or they want to, verify their donation before they give. But then we know that in actuality, a lot of giving is actually done based on impulse and emotion. And so we think that's great, but it's certainly in some cases that gets people into trouble and they end up giving where they didn't intend to, and in the long run that might even discourage the culture of giving. So so if you guys have any insights on kind of how to build that identity in people, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Leah, thanks for saying that emotion is important, because I do think that is an important component of why people give. There's a host of reasons why people decide to open up their wallets and give to organizations. And if it's because of an emotional appeal and that's meaningful to somebody, that's, I think, just as quote unquote wise as giving, because you want to be informed about the impact. But for the people who do care about like the impact they're giving and want to make sure that they're giving to an organization that is optimizing their charitable dollars, you talked about research, and the thing we see over and again is that people say they want to do research. There's a high number of people on surveys that claim that they do research, but ultimately what happens is that when it comes down to it, they don't. What we found to be effective is giving people some level of validation that is credible, easy to understand, and checks that minimum threshold that people need to feel like, okay, I feel confident that my money will be used wisely. It diminishes the regret aversion, the regret they may have. So people will be turned away because of that type of fear of the dollars being misused or underutilized. It can be mitigated. So there are ways of designing useful pieces of information for people who want to do things that are impactful in a way that is streamlined and doesn't add onerous steps to the donation process. You also mentioned identity. If I could just quickly say that we're thinking a lot about this as well. How do we make sure that when people are giving wisely, that there's a feedback loop that builds the identity of being a thoughtful giver and builds the identity of being a giver towards certain causes, so that future giving just reinforces that, or if it's not the right identity, if people feel like it's off, that they adjust their giving accordingly.
Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just to echo what Omar said on the informed giving front. I think we need to remember that maybe some people do want to pour through, Form 990 online to validate the charities that they support. But for a lot of people, they do want a meaningful shortcut, whether that's the great work that you guys do with certifications and standards, whether that's badges. There's a reason that people look at operating expense ratios, and that's because it's easy to see and it's easy to compare across charities. To the extent that we can continue to promote those validation signals to make that decision a little bit easier, and sort of consistent forms of impact measurement, I think we need to remember that that will often be what people are going to look at, as opposed to, really in-depth research online.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up a couple of questions that actually came in ahead of time. So, and we still kind of haven't covered those subjects, but they're roughly related to what we're speaking to right now. So one of them, and we received more than one on this theme, is on kind of memberships and getting commitments from people. I think that speaks to kind of like building their identity, right? So they're asking if there's any behavioral insights on how to convert people from someone who's just kind of likes puppies to someone who wants to commit to puppies on a monthly basis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're trying to crack that nut. I wish I have some thoughts, but it's important, going back to that feedback loop, to make sure that people, even when they're giving on a monthly basis, don't feel like their donations are just going off in a black hole and it's out of mind as well. Like a lot of times, and I've seen more sophistication over the years, but in the past I've given on a monthly basis to organizations, and I get a form at the end of the year with my tax information, and that's about it. So it's important for the charity to in some way to reinforce that identity and make people feel like they are building and strengthening that identity as they continue to give as a member, as opposed to a one-off gift. And that could help cultivate a stronger relationship that's more difficult to sever.
Mm-hmm. The other, we got multiple questions that are kind of related to each other, but they go to how to convince someone to give money for overhead, or how to, if some charities had, I think, the feeling that their causes might not be as sexy or as urgent as other charities have, but they're still worthy. So how to get donors to kind of commit to that kind of engaging or donation to something that's less emotional and less urgent. They're hard questions. Wait, I think the sector, the sector is like kind of actively getting into a wall with those. So
Yeah,
if you don't have anything right,
there's no
maybe
reason.
there isn't like. Yeah.
Of course, they're going to be stumped on those. I think we all are pretty stumped on what to do about that.
Yeah.
There was one interesting question I thought, though, on someone wanted to know about the importance of creating a sense of urgency when everything already is urgent, and how do we create appeals that sort of stand out in a world where everything is urgent? If there's any insight on that, I guess that might be also a $50 million answer to that question, but I thought we should put it out there. And another question had to do with investing in medical research, which has less of an emotional connection than actually helping someone, particularly who has a disease, for instance. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, can I start with the urgency one? So, we see very different donor behaviors when it comes to natural disasters. And a big part of that is the intensity of the problem, but also the urgency that goes along with it. When you have evergreen problems, it's really hard to build in that same sense of urgency, even if it is a problem that needs to be dealt with ASAP. I would distinguish, though, the urgency of the problem and the urgency of the gift. And what I mean by that is it's easy to procrastinate. We human beings do it all the time, and we have the intentions to do something, and we have limited attention, and because of that, we end up pushing it off, and the donation gets forgotten about. So how do we make sure that people feel like they need to make a gift and they need to make it now, and help them complete that gift as soon as possible? Part of that is reducing the hassles, but also there's a framing around the gift and why this moment is so important. Giving Tuesday does a great job of that and making it feel like this is the time you need to give on this one day. I've seen things that don't work as well. I got a solicitation the other day that I needed to give today because there's a donor who's giving 3 times the match for today only. I didn't give that day, and the next day I got an email from the same organization saying, you have to give today, there's a 4-time match. So I was like, wait, I should wait till tomorrow. There may be 5 times of match. So we have to be careful about the credibility of these urgency claims. So I think having a relationship with the donors and creating an understanding that there's an importance to donate at this moment and it's a credible reason, justification for it could really help people feel like giving now is something they need to do.
Well, look, go ahead, Katie, and this will be the last word. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say, and to Elvia's point around the framing of the relationship. So a recurring gift, if you frame it as a subscription or a membership, it feels very different than if I'm just asking you to give over and over again, right? So I think some of this is less about breaking through the noise by bombarding people with something that's grabbing their attention and more about what is our ongoing relationship, and how can I present the choice of the relationship to you in a way that is long-term as opposed to short-term.
Well, look, I want to thank everyone for joining. We're out of time, and for sharing your insights. And I hope everyone here enjoyed the responses as much as I did. What we'd like, though, is for you to also give us feedback by emailing Julie Rizzo, and her email address is jrizzo@give.org, jrizzo@give.org. And we also want you to know that you're going to receive a short follow-up survey about the session. Feedback is incredibly important for us as we think about how we can devise future sessions that will be helpful and useful to you. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day. And we'll see you next time.